All right, Al, thank you very much. Now our exclusive interview with the former Vice President, Dick Cheney. His highly anticipated new book, In My Time, a personal and political memoir, is being released today. And we're very pleased to have Dick Cheney with us in the studio this morning. Vice President Cheney, it's good to see you.
Good to be here, Matt.
You have been called a lot of things over the years. You've been called skillful, dynamic. You've been called controversial and divisive. Some people have called you the most divisive political figure in this country in a century. Do you think it's all political, or do you think there's something about your personality, your demeanor, that inspires animosity in your critics?
Well, I can't speak for them, Matt. You're right. You left out Darth Vader. That's been included.
I figured that'd been said a lot.
Yeah, I think it's varied over the years. When I was Secretary of Defense, I got rave notices and high ratings. By the end of my time as Vice President, I was down pretty low, but partly that had to do with policy, and I was a big advocate of pursuing controversial policies in order to keep the country safe, and our critics obviously extracted their pound of flesh for that.
In your book, there are times where you tell stories that are slightly different than the way President Bush tells them in his account, in his book that was released in the last year or so. You seem to take credit for certain policy decisions that he says were his. At other times, you seem to take center stage a little more than he gives you credit for taking at the time. Did you talk to President Bush before sending this book to the press? And what was his reaction to those differences specifically?
I did not cooperate or coordinate on our books. He wrote his book, I wrote my book. I felt strongly that I wanted to write what I remembered about these events, and that's the way both of us function.
You think he'll be upset by some of the differences that you highlight?
I don't believe so. I called him, and when I sent him the copy of the book.
So you did send it to him in advance?
Yes.
And what was his reaction?
Well, he hadn't read it yet. I assume he's read it by now, but he hadn't had time to read it then. I think what happens, and it's important to remember this, if they were identical in their treatment of these events, people would say, oh, it looks like plagiarism to us, or they cooperated.
It's a conspiracy.
Conspiracy of some kind. In fact, what it was a serious effort by me to put down the events I remember. I'm sure the president did the same.
Enhanced interrogation techniques. In your book, you state bluntly you have no regrets about being in favor of things like waterboarding. I think you say even that if circumstances were the same today, you'd make the same decisions. You write this, quote, "The interrogation program was safe, legal, and effective. It provided intelligence that enabled us to prevent attacks and save American lives." So let me ask you this question. I asked President Bush the same question. If an American citizen were to be taken into captivity in Iran, for example, and the government of Iran were to look at that person and say, we think you're a spy for the U.S. or you're here to carry out a covert operation, would it be okay for the Iranian government to waterboard that American citizen?
Well, we probably would object to it.
On the grounds that it's torture?
On the grounds that we have obligations towards our citizens, and that we do everything we can to protect our citizens and to put them through a process that we think is appropriate.
So why was it okay for us to use what most people would say was torture against terror suspects?
Well, remember, first of all, these were not American citizens. We weren't dealing with American citizens in the enhanced interrogation program. Secondly, it was people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. There were a handful, 2 or 3, for example, that actually got waterboarded. Third, we had good reason to believe they had information that we could only get from them, and that they knew more than anybody else.
But if the government of Iran were to capture someone and say, we have reason to believe that you're a spy, or you're carrying out an operation that could be damaging to our country, would you object, or would you say they did what they had to do to get the information they needed at the time?
Well, I think we would object, because we wouldn't expect an American citizen to be operating that way. When you're dealing with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example, a man who was the self-admitted mastermind of 9/11, killed 3,000 Americans, and at a time when we had very little knowledge and understanding about al-Qaeda and what they were doing, and after we'd gone through a lot of other procedures and interrogation efforts, then at the end of that process, he was subjected to the program. But it was very carefully supervised. None of the techniques used were things that we hadn't already used on our own people.
But you know, though, that if you were to conduct a poll in this country right now and ask people, is waterboarding torture, I think the vast majority of people would say it is.
And I would argue, Matt, that it's important for us not to get caught up in the notion that you can only have popular methods of interrogation if you want to run an effective counterterrorism program. Fact is, it worked. We learned valuable information from that process, and we kept the country safe for over 7 years.
In President Bush's book, Decision Points, he writes about a meeting during the build-up to the war in Iraq. You two were sitting, I think it was at a lunch, actually, and you're talking about Saddam Hussein, and you looked at him and you said, are you going to take this guy out or what? Would you admit to or concede to the fact that you were perhaps the driving force that convinced President Bush to go to war with Iraq?
I think the president made the decision. He felt strongly about it, too. He understood the dimensions of what we were doing. I certainly supported it. I advocated it. I thought it was the right policy. I believe that's still today.
He says he was on the fence for a very long time. You write in your book about a situation, I think it was on the eve of going to war. The advisors are all gathered around. They're talking about the pros and cons of going after a target believed to be housing Saddam Hussein. And you write in your book that he kicked all the other advisors out of the room and he keeps you there, and he says, I'm paraphrasing here, Dick, what do you think we should do? So clearly he was putting an enormous amount of faith in your opinion.
Right.
So do you think you were the person that pushed him off the fence and in the direction of war?
I can't make that case. I can tell you what I believed and what I supported, and that was that we needed to, in fact, take the action we did.
We all have the benefit of hindsight now, and we sit here some 8 years later. 4,000 Americans lost their lives. Maybe 100,000 Iraqis lost their lives. It cost about $1 trillion. Was it worth it? Did you give the right advice?
I think I did. If you look back at the proposition we faced after 9/11, with respect to Saddam Hussein, we were very concerned about the prospects of terrorists like the 9/11 crowd acquiring weapons of mass destruction, biological agent or nuclear weapon that they could use on the United States. I think that's still the biggest threat we face.
But still worth
and
it.
At the time, to go after Saddam Hussein and take him down, we eliminated a major source of proliferation. And when we took down Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi got religion and gave up all of his nukes.
But given the fact that
it was the right thing to do.
Given the fact that it severely damaged our reputation around the world, and there were no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, you still think it's worth it?
Oh, sure. I don't think that it damaged our reputation around the world. I just don't believe that. I think the critics here at home would argue that, but in fact, I think it was sound policy that dealt with a very serious problem and that eliminated Saddam Hussein from the kind of problem he presented before. What would have happened this week if Muammar Gaddafi had still been in power with a nuclear weapon in Libya? Would he have fled? I doubt it.
One person you go after specifically in this book is former Secretary of State Colin Powell. One of your most pointed criticisms about him is this, quote, time and again I heard that he was opposed to the war in Iraq. Indeed, I continue to hear it today. But never once in any meeting did I hear him voice objection. In an interview this weekend, I think you now know, Colin Powell insists that he told the president about his objections to the war in Iraq. And in his memoir, President Bush specifically says that he knew about Colin Powell's reservation. So why are you barking up this tree?
Well, I wrote the events as I participated in them. The fact of the matter is, if you look, for example, at my comments about General Powell, I've got 3 chapters on my time as Secretary of Defense, basically all very positive on General Powell, how I recommended him to be Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how we worked together for 4 years in the Pentagon, how together we commanded Desert Storm. So there's a lot of very positive stuff in there, but a balanced account I think also required me to put down what my opinion was, and that's what I've done.
You know, you've been called the most powerful vice president in history. There was the talk that you were the one running the White House, not George Bush, and I don't want to deliberate that. But given the fact that you were so powerful, what do you think your greatest achievement was as vice president, either in policy or some other area during the 8 years of the Bush presidency?
I think the most important thing we did, Matt.
I'm talking about your specific.
Well, but I was part of a team. I wasn't out there by myself on most of these issues. The most important thing we did was after 9/11, we prevented all further mass casualty attacks against the United States. Now, on September 12th of 2001, nobody would have been willing to bet that we could do that, but we did.
After September 11th, the Bush administration had about 7 years to hunt down and kill Osama bin Laden, and it didn't happen on George Bush's watch. Does it irk you at all that it's President Obama who gets to say, we got him?
No, I think you've got to give him credit, and I did publicly at the time.
I know you did.
But I think it's also fair to say that there were thousands of people out there, especially the career professionals in the military, the special ops community, in the intelligence community, that devoted 10 years of their lives to tracking this guy down. It started under Bush. We worked it for 7 years. We passed it on to President Obama, and he was there when the call was made to send in the troops. He gets credit for that.
On a personal note, in the book, you write about the hunting accident where you accidentally shot your friend Harry Whittington, and you call it one of the saddest days of your life. How did it make you feel, Vice President Cheney, when that incident was turned into a punchline for late-night comics?
Well, when you're vice president, you'd better be prepared to be a punchline. The president...
Did it hurt, though?
Well, no. You've got to live with it. Obviously, my concern about Mr. Whittington was heartfelt. He and I've got a great relationship. One of the nicest letters I've received from anybody came from Harry last year when I was sick and in the hospital. But in terms of people taking pot shots at the vice president, it goes with the turf, Matt.
Based on what you write in your book and what President Bush writes in his book, your relationship pretty good between the two of you. Mm-hmm. But it was strained at the end of his presidency when he refused to pardon your chief of staff, Scooter Libby, who'd been convicted of perjury charges. You were, by all accounts, furious, mm-hmm. and you let him know it. Mm-hmm. Why were you so mad? And now, with a little time having passed, do you understand his decision more?
Well, I felt very strongly that Scooter was not treated fairly. I don't think an indictment was appropriate. I think the investigation was originally occasioned by the question of who revealed the name of a Secret Service, of a CIA employee to the press. And the answer was Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State. That was known from the very beginning. In spite of that, they went forward with a 2-year investigation, drug a lot of people at the White House before the grand jury. Scooter was the one ultimately who was charged, not with leaking, right, but with allegations about misconduct during the course of the investigation. So I really think he was badly treated. I thought he deserved a pardon. The president disagreed. He got to make the decision.
Have you two gotten over that?
Well, it's one we still disagree with. I mean, if it were to come up today between the two of us, he'd state his view, I'd state mine. It's not going to change.
Vice President Dick Cheney. Mr. Cheney, thanks for being with us this morning. I appreciate it.
Well, Matt, I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And the book is called In My Time. It's out today. We're back in a moment. This is Today on NBC.
Thank you.